So we're going to be looking at Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel lecture. And instead of looking at the entire transcript, which I will actually make available to you in the same way that I've done the others, um, with annotations on the side, for this one, because it is actually quite long and it is quite dense, what I've done is I've actually found a resource that has some of the key things within it. I'm going to just speak to that to you. So the voice of Aung San Suu Kyi, just a bit of context, she won the Nobel Peace Prize, was under house arrest for an extended period of time, and this is her Nobel lecture. When you win the Nobel Prize, you give a lecture. It goes for like half an hour, and it's quite long, quite dense. It's interesting, but if you want to watch it, that's genuinely that's up to you. I'm not going to force you. So she is a voice of peace, hence Nobel Peace Prize. Her primary objective is to inspire hope that change is possible, as well as to highlight continued suffering within the world. She speaks very firmly on the rights of women and children, and the idea that tolerance for women and women's rights isn't the absence of intolerance, but rather the presence of understanding, which I think is a really important point for her and the way in which she addresses her audience. She uses a lot of positive emotive language in her writing, particularly when talking about those points that are bolstering her point. She uses the words like wonderful or grateful. And at the same time, there is notes of sarcasm, particularly when talking about those in charge that are counterproductive to what she wants for the world, which is an enduring peace. So she'll use phrases along the lines of war toys for grown men, and almost infantilizing the men in power who are like being the dominant force of that aggression. So the first thing to highlight is she speaks to the power of the Peace Prize. Often during my days of house arrest, I felt as though I were no longer part of the real world. She will consistently, within the speech, use anecdotes to relate her own personal experiences and what she's seen and what she's experienced to the broader concepts in which she wants to talk about. And that is highlighted there, where she talks about why the Peace Prize is actually really important to her, and this idea that this is this is her platform. The importance of the prize really is the platform that's given her to speak about Burma and the rights, the human rights issues that she's genuinely still passionate about. The second thing she talks about is ignoring the suffering of others fuels war, and talks about the idea that all war is based on suffering. It's based on someone else's suffering for someone else's gain. And that's really clear in that first sentence that is provided, that the First World War represents a terrifying waste of youth and potential, a cruel squandering of the positive forces of our planet. The language she uses is really, really high modality. It's a terrifying waste of youth and potential, cruel squandering. Like, this is very clearly positioned language to highlight herself as a force of change, and highlight us as the audience as people who could inspire change or promote change and promote peace, but also is really aggressive to the actions of the past that have propagated this loss. And which is highlighted with that next bit, and for what? That rhetorical question, which is steeped in irony and which is steeped in sarcasm, continues on with this criticism of war and the nature of war itself, and this idea that war cannot be a vehicle for peace, and that war is only a vehicle for suffering and is fueled by suffering. She highlights the fact that we live in an enlightened age, and this talks about the idea of democracy. It talks about technology. It talks about conscious, and it talks about collective ideas of peace and human rights, particularly because looking at the context she comes from, where she was an advocate of change and was placed under house arrest for it. She's looking at the broader picture of the world and how much has changed. She fundamentally believes that perfect peace must be our goal. Absolute peace in our world is an unattainable goal, but it is one towards which we must continue to journey. Our eyes fixed on it as a traveler in the desert fixes his eyes on one guiding star that will lead him to salvation. That simile of the traveler in the desert is really really poignant for what she's trying to say. Is that idea of like this concept of a perfect peace. While it seems like it might not have actually come to fruition, it is the hope that we need to guide us in the same, and that's the implication of that simile. Because if you're like lost in the desert, you don't have anything but hope that you're going to get out. And she's equating that where the world we live in at the moment with all of the atrocities that happen and the lack of peace is that desert. It's harsh and it's unforgiving. And the suggestion is that we need to strive for that better. So because it won't happen unless we actually strive for it. Even if we do not achieve a perfect peace on Earth, because perfect peace is not of this earth, common endeavors to gain peace will unite individuals and nations in trust and friendship, help to make our human community safer and kinder. So it's this idea that striving for the peace, while it might not be attainable, will always be better and will always be stronger than the alternative. And that's where she's using this inclusive tone, and she's using that incredibly positive language and that positive emotive language to highlight why the benefits of what she's saying is as opposed to the comparison, and making the audience feel like they agree with what's happening. She talks about the peacemaking power of kindness, of the sweets of adversity, and let me say that they are not numerous. I have found that the sweetest, most precious of all, is the lesson I learned on the value of kindness. So she's using irony, this idea of the sweets of adversity. It's very much a paradox or an antithesis, if you will, because something, the connotation of the word adversity doesn't lend itself to the word sweet. And so the placing of that phrasing, the sweetness of adversity, highlights the importance of kindness for what she's talking about in terms of achieving peace and striving for peace. Every kindness I received, small or big, convinced me that there could never be enough of it in the world. So again, just coming back to that anecdote of her own experience to highlight what she's trying to say. And the last thing that she talks about is imagining a world without refugees. Ultimately, aim to create a world free of the displaced, the homeless, and the hopeless. So that rule of three to create that idea. A world in which each and every corner is a true sanctuary where the inhabitants will have freedom and the capacity to live in peace. Every thought, every word, and every action, again, rule of three, that adds the positive and the wholesome is a contribution to peace. Each and every one of us is capable of making such a contribution. Let us join hands to create a peaceful world where we can sleep in security and wake in happiness. That call to action towards the end is actually quite fitting for the rest of the speech, where she talks about what could happen and what should happen. And she really ends it in that note of, this is what we have to do now. So this is a summary. There is much more of that speech. And if you want to go through it, you can. But if you don't, this is probably enough to get you a paragraph or two.